Welcome back, or welcome to The Growth Project, a podcast by AMPLOS. My name is Cory Shaffer, joined today again by Marlee Johnson. Hello, Marlee.
Hello, Cory.
All right, what do we got today, Marlee? What do you want to get into here?
Yeah, so we've got some questions here today about performance and the mindset things that help us perform better and keep a high level of performance over time. So we'll jump right into some questions here.
And wait, pause for a second. So I think what we're going to do is I'm going to try to answer these questions from more of the individual performer level, right? And you're going to offer some perspective on teams.
Yes.
And we can kind of go back and forth on that, but I want to set the stage here appropriately for our listeners. All right, ready
Perfect.
to go. Now where are we starting?
All right, so question number one. So in your expert opinion, what are the biggest mental traps that hold people back from reaching their full potential?
Yeah, great question. The first thing that came to mind for me is I'm just thinking back, years of experience, especially working with individual performers. And I'm gonna probably lean in the direction of working of the work that I do in sport here. Just a lot more reps, so to speak, in that area. So mental traps that hold people back, I think the first thing that came to mind was they tie their confidence solely to their performance.
Yeah.
That's the first thing. And the reason why I say that that's a trap is because for a lot of young athletes, you can do that, especially the type of kids that I've experienced working with, the ones who are at these elite Division I programs like a Clemson, like an Oregon. Those are the best of the best from wherever they're coming from in their sport. And to a degree, they've been able to do that, right? To their entire career to get to that point because they've always been the best. They could always look to outcomes as a reminder for how good they are and feel good about that, right? Gain some confidence from it. When you see that in the college level, though, that's a very, very slippery slope. And oftentimes that's how kids are coming in. So as a freshman, in their mind, their confidence is based off of I've always been the star player. I've always been a high performer. So statistics and playing time, wins and losses, all those things have always sort of just gone my way, right?
Right.
For the first time, those things are much harder to come by. Might not even sniff the starting lineup. When you do get opportunities to perform, even if it's in practice and so on, it's just harder because you're facing better competition. And so for the first time, failure comes at a clip that they've just never experienced before.
Right.
Many of them. And again, as long as they've fallen into this trap where they believe that they have to perform well and feel a certain type of way about themselves in order to play well, it's just not a great place to be in. And it's very, very common. I see it quite a bit. So that was one of the first things that came to mind for me. And I feel like, again, very, very common with the population that I've been around. And to a degree, it probably resonates quite a bit. I've actually had conversations with people in the corporate world, people in sales roles, for example. Many of them, let's just say, coming back to sport for a second, probably former athletes or competitive in some regard. So they get into sales and they think if I just follow the script, if I just do what I'm supposed to do, I'll just make a sale.
Right.
And then they'll go 6 months without making a sale and just be miserable in their job and not very confident at all in what they're doing. And again, the point there is you're basing your confidence, something that's within your control, you're basing on something that's out of your control. That's why it's such a trap, I think.
Yeah. And I think it's easy coming in, especially with athletes growing up in these travel sport cultures where they're doing one thing and it is so tied to your identity.
Yes.
And the same is true with work. I think, especially in America, we tie our work to our identity. So my follow-up question to you then is, what should we be thinking about?
Yeah, so I try to educate these youngsters on this, but even looking at old psychology theory and self-efficacy, for example, which may be used interchangeably with confidence. I'm sure there's some nerd out there who would disagree, but the point is Albert Bandura had a theory of self-efficacy. And basically, there are multiple sources of self-efficacy, or places that you can go to get that feeling that like, hey, I can do this. And performance is one of those, areas, like mastery experiences. You want to be able to draw on experience of like, hey, I have done this before. Okay. But that's just one piece, right?
Right.
Some of these other pieces, for example, one that I always think is really fascinating is your own physiological state, right? So if I step into the performance domain and my body is so out of whack, right? Like I'm shaky, I'm tense because I'm so nervous about what I'm doing. My body is actually sending me signals that like, we're not very confident right now.
Right.
Right. Like, so interestingly, I always think that one's kind of fascinating, right? Is because your body's pretty much telling you like, hey, you're not ready for this, but you can learn to control that. Okay?
Right.
That's why I have a job. So that's one, vicarious experiences I think is interesting, right? Like being able to see somebody else do the thing and be like, well, if they can do it, I can do it, right? We're not too, dissimilar. Verbal persuasion. That's sort of two-way street. That's obviously the people around you. And if you have coaches and significant people saying like, hey, you can do this, but then also obviously yourself, right? And your own inner dialogue. Those are a few of the sources, but the point is I want the people that I work with to learn to base the confidence more so off of a couple of things. Number one is your preparation. And what I always come back to, just because everybody can relate, even non-athletes, is school, right? The question I always ask is what determines whether or not you're confident when you sit down and take a test in class? And the number one answer every time is like some variation of preparation, right? It's like, oh, well, if I studied. Exactly, right? Like if you went to class and if you studied and you did the homework assignments and you did the practice tests, maybe you went to office hours, like you're going in and you feel fully prepared, you at least have a chance to be confident.
Right.
Right. But I always follow this up because it's true. There are people who prepare extremely, extremely well in school who still show up and find a way to not be confident. Have you seen this?
Yes.
So people who especially suffer from like test anxiety are some of the hardest working people, right? They tend to have all the knowledge because they work hard, they prepare. What they don't have sort of aligning to that is the right kind of self-talk.
Right.
Right. So they still find a way to doubt, well, what if this is on there? I didn't prepare for that. Or what if the professor does this? Or what if I didn't study enough? What if this? Like they find a way to talk themselves out of being prepared.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So all the preparation is there, the foundation is set, and yet they talk themselves out of it. And so to me, we need both elements, right? We need to prepare really well. And the phrasing, the language that I use here is like, you earn the right now to talk to yourself, and this is a very specific word, in a credible way, like a real way.
Right.
Right? Like you can't lie to yourself and just be like, oh yeah, no, I'm ready, when you didn't even open the book.
Yeah.
Like, you're not ready. Okay. So when I've done the work, if I prepared well, now I've earned the right to talk to myself in a way that's credible, and that inner dialogue can be legitimate and believable. That sets the stage for confidence. And again, the reason why that's so important is we're shifting our confidence to something that's controllable. Right? Because I can determine my process and how I prepare, and I can determine what that inner voice is saying. And it's not about just the outcome, the result, when there are so many variables that can influence that.
Yeah, 100%. Process over outcome.
Exactly. So let's shift this to you from a team standpoint. What's different, or what are some of the biggest mental traps you see in teams?
Yeah, and I might take this a little bit in a different direction than you, but the first thing my brain went to is, we've talked a lot on this podcast about the importance of, the first trap I thought of was teams that don't set roles, responsibilities, have a vision. But I really think that maybe the biggest one is it's teams when they don't focus on the interpersonal stuff at the outset. When there's, we talk through roles, responsibilities, and what we're going to do, but then conflict happens because it happens on every team, and we haven't talked through how we're going to deal with conflict. Or somebody gets really down and we don't know our teammate well enough to know how to pick them back up. Or you name it, anything that's interpersonal that inevitably happens at any point in a team's life cycle. If you don't talk about it at the outset, when it does happen, you're just setting yourself up to fail, because it's not necessarily things that you would think of that are related to the task that you're trying to perform, but they do impact team effectiveness and how effective you're going to be. And so that was where my brain went.
So make that a little bit more concrete. Like, what would that look like, or give us an example?
Yeah, well, so we had this class example, I guess, like a demonstration where I was in an 8-person class on teamwork last semester. And the task was we had to form a team, pick a task that we were going to do as a team that we weren't actually going to do, but we were pretending. And we had to basically set ourselves up to be successful. And we spent 40 of the 50 class minutes talking about the task and our roles and responsibilities, and maybe 5 minutes talking about when conflict comes up, how are we going to deal with it? Again, if somebody gets down, how are we going to deal with it? And then the professor started giving us all these scenarios about things that we had to deal with as a team. And much more than that, little 5% of what we talked about was about conflict coming up, or people getting down, or things not going our way and us having to overcome it ourselves. And we weren't prepared for it because we didn't have a plan.
Well, and I would argue even you giving 5% of your time to it is more than what most teams do.
Yes. And that was because we had the prompt on the screen and we were like, oh no, we didn't get to this question.
Right. Yeah. But I mean, is that something that you've seen though? Again, I've worked, at least in the sports setting, I've worked for quite a while now, and sat through a lot of those early kind of beginning of the year meetings, where we're like, coaches will run through, hey, here are our team rules and here are expectations, and here's what we're going to wear to practice every day, and so on. But rarely do you ever hear anything in the vein of what you're talking about.
Yeah, I mean, you rarely hear about, okay, this is how we're going to celebrate things. This is how we're going to talk about stuff when they don't go well. Like all of those little interpersonal, emotion-based things, we don't think to make a plan for them, but they're really important because they do impact how we perform. So
then I guess what you're saying here, maybe I'm kind of jumping too far ahead, but if we haven't talked about that, if we don't have clarity on it, these things occur. Oftentimes, probably handle them poorly.
Yes.
or just maybe not as well as we could have if it was a little more refined, right?
Yeah.
And what then? What tends to happen?
If we don't do that?
Yeah.
The conflict goes poorly and it becomes personal, right? So instead of I keep going back to conflict. There's other ways this could happen. But in the case of conflict, conflict is a good thing when it's focused on the task and we can work through stuff and come up with new ideas and do that. But if we've not talked about everybody being on the same page of we're having conflict because we care about what the team is doing, then it becomes personal. And now it's not Cory and Marlee working on a problem solving together. It's Marlee just attacked Cory because X, Y, Z, because we didn't acknowledge from the outset that we're working together, and there's probably going to be some tension at points in time. Let's be on the same page about why there would be that and how we're going to get through it.
Yeah. So then I guess what I'm getting at, right, is you turn a molehill into a mountain fast.
Really fast.
What should have just been this one very isolated incident and probably just a product of kind of not being on the same page or something getting lost in translation ends up becoming something bigger.
Yeah.
And these little things, I think in my experience, are happening every day.
100%.
Every day. And think about it, some of these teams, right? Imagine a football team where there's 130 student athletes.
Right.
How many relationships are involved on any given day where this is sort of at stake?
Yeah.
And how at any given time those things could be handled poorly. And a lot of mountains start getting formed.
Yeah. And divisions within a
Exactly.
team. And that's the last thing you want. You want everybody moving in the same direction. So the second you've got issues with each other or you're missing opportunities to build relationships with each other where it could be stronger, now we're all of a sudden not moving all in the same direction. And that's ineffective.
So what does this look like? I know we've spent some time talking on about sports, and to me, and you know this well, being a former athlete and working in this space too, the seasonality of sports kind of sets itself up for success in that way of every team, you're going to have a new team. So there's always those beginning of the year meetings where we reestablish hey, here's who we are and so on. That doesn't happen much in the corporate world.
No.
So what would it look like there, especially when employees, there's not really a seasonality to it. People are kind of coming and going in different ways. So how do you do this there?
I think it's intentionality. Like my brain went immediately to onboarding. And when you're bringing people in, I feel like it's not necessarily those meetings. Meetings are important, and like setting norms in meetings are important, yearly or whatever the rhythm is. But I think at least teams that I've worked with or experiences I've heard from other people, it's those water cooler moments when somebody was intentional enough to be like, hey, here's how we do things around here. Like, let me guide you through this for the first few, however long it is. Just helping you kind of navigate the waters and like integrate you in and pull you in. Because some of this stuff happens because people were not integrated in very well. And now they're on the team, but they're not really a part of the team. And it would have just taken one person to say like, hey, come with me. Yeah. But that takes time to do and effort to do. And
there are probably some organizations who look to skirt that by like, oh, we need to put a new section in the handbook.
Yeah.
But nobody's reading the handbook.
Right. And the handbook might change and then nobody says anything or.
Right.
So it's all about relationships and getting invited in.
Okay. Good stuff.
Great. All right. Moving to number 2. So if you could eliminate one self-limiting behavior in most people, what would that be?
See, this is hard because, I've got to lump myself into this category. So part of this is therapy at the moment. But I think just very general and sort of broad stroke here, in taking self-limiting, like taking that very literally and seriously, it's making excuses. I think everybody has a tendency to do this, to want to like cut corners, to validate our behavior in a certain way, to just make sense of it and why it explains why we acted a certain way. When, if we're honest, it's just an excuse.
Yeah.
And I'm thinking specifically even related to things more in the realm of like performance and wellness and bettering yourself and all these types of things, right? Like whether it's, a corporate person who says like, oh, I need to exercise more, but I don't have time. Well, that's an excuse.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? That's what we're talking about. It's, and again, for me, generally speaking, do a lot of things really well when it comes to like health and wellness, but then the weekend rolls around, diet's not quite great, right? And instead of being a cheat meal, it becomes like a cheat weekend where I'm eating a lot of bad meals. And there's just the like, oh, but I'll get it back on track on Monday, or like, oh, well, I worked hard this week, so I've earned the right to do this. And I'm not saying that that's necessarily bad. It's more the frequency of how much that tends to happen.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And if that's sort of an exception as opposed to the norm, then fine. But just the language specifically around that I really attach to, and what's self-limiting, that's what I landed on. Or where my mind went just right out of the gate was just like, we are pretty bad in terms of making excuses to validate poor behavior.
Yeah, and it almost sounds like what you were talking about too, just sometimes those excuses become habit. Like it allows you to perpetuate habits that are not good for you.
Absolutely. If you can explain it away, it's amazing how we have that ability, right? To kind of explain our behavior away. And then before you know it, 6 months has passed by and you've now explained that behavior away for 6 months straight.
And now it's stuck.
And now that's just the pattern of behavior that you're in. And so maybe that's too broad, but that's where my mind went to. And, how do you, if you're going to follow up with, or our listeners are probably asking like, okay, well, yeah, that I fall into that trap. Like, what can I do about it? Number one, good luck. I think like everything that we tend to talk about, it starts with a little bit of awareness, like recognizing within yourself, especially if you have that feeling of like, I probably should be doing X, but I'm doing Y instead. That right there is an indicator of you're probably making an excuse or validating a decision when you know what the right thing to do.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And again, the expectation here is not to turn people or life into some robotic process, but those should be exceptions and not the norm. And way too often, I think, and guilty of this myself, but it just becomes the norm a little bit too much.
Yeah, for sure.
What about
For sure.
from a team standpoint? Maybe that's a little bit trickier to.
I was on the same page as you with this one. I was thinking just the excuse of we don't have enough time to do blank, and like not taking enough time, like we talked about, to get the interpersonal stuff straight at the outset, or talk about roles, responsibilities. But also like on the back end, after a team has like worked together for a while, we don't have time to reflect on this and learn. Mm-hmm. We don't have time for this, that, and the other. We don't have time to pull this person in and get them up to speed, or to hold somebody accountable, or all of these things that take not very much time, but they feel like big feats because we're not used to sitting around and reflecting on performance together, and it's uncomfortable. Taking the time for the doctor to build psych safety by when the nurse is walking in the room and just saying, hey, I need your help. Like that's an uncomfortable, very short conversation, but we explain it away with not having enough time. So just that like busyness that we talk about, I would say that's the biggest self-limiting, team-limiting thing.
Yeah, and then unfortunately, and I know we've talked about this some on the podcast over time. I remember Drew and I having a conversation. Unfortunately, what ends up happening then is something unfortunate and more cataclysmic needs to happen in order for us to be like, oh man, we really need to slow down and do some of these things.
Yeah.
Like we wait for some catastrophe. We wait for hardship to be the catalyst to like get back on track. And in some cases, I don't want to say it's too late, but in some cases it is. If you're talking again, like the seasonality of sports, you wait until there's 2 weeks left in the season to have your come to Jesus meeting with the group. It's too late. Yep. Sorry. You know what I mean? This ship has sailed. Organizations, again, there's no timeline like that. So you have the time for that whenever it comes. But again, it's like how many damaged relationships are there? How many poor quarters do we have in the books because we let these things just sort of fester until it became a problem when this person left, or when we got absolutely dominated by the competition, or whatever it is. I think for the individual and the team level, that tends to be a product of just not taking the time to do these things, or making even what we mentioned earlier, right? Like making excuses at the individual level. You do that again and again and again. At some point, you just develop bad behavior, bad habits. Yeah. And then that leads to some big problem potentially. Right. And then it's like, oh man, I should change.
Yeah. And now it's really hard because you've got it, at the individual level, it's a habit, or at the team level, it's your culture. Correct. And now everybody has those habits because we just don't talk about it, or we just don't whatever.
And the cost of that, this actually would be fascinating to hear at the corporate level. I'm sure somebody who's attempted to study this would be very, very complex, but like what actually is the cost of that? Yeah. You know what I mean? And in true like dollars and cents, that's how a lot of corporate people tend to think. That would be interesting. In sports, you can see it because it's almost like cultures get so bad to the point where they need completely rebuilt. That takes years sometimes.
And they get destroyed not in years. It can be one couple week stretch where it's like poof, everything's done. Yep. So yeah, and just like it's like daily hygiene, right? Like taking the time to reflect, and it's all these little things that you do. It's missed opportunities to sustain something really good when you don't do them. So the opportunity cost, in my mind, is way on the opportunity.
A lot of this stuff, and this language comes from an article actually I remember you sent to me, and this was more about communication and feedback, but I think you could lump a lot of things into this category. Is we need to treat more of this stuff like breakfast and not Thanksgiving. Yes. Right? Like this is not just some one-time thing that we address once a year in some meeting. These are just things that we constantly need to keep up with. And daily there are opportunities to kind of reinforce like, hey, here's how we do things.
Yeah. Yeah. 100%.
Okay.
Cool.
Do we want to hit one more here and try to...
Yeah. I think we can do it.
Let's do it.
So last one. So how do elite performers sustain motivation over the long haul?
Yeah, I wrote 2 words here. They don't.
That's a great answer.
Yeah, I think that's the honest answer. Now, I think there is maybe this separate category of almost like complete outlier people. Okay. And again, my mind comes back to sport here, so I apologize for that. Actually, I don't apologize for that. I like sports, and I was sort of, trained in sports. So you think the Tom Brady's and the Michael Jordans and, so on the surface, they just appeared to be motivated forever, right? And they always found a way to kind of light the fire and get that done. You learn about that, though, I think after the fact, like The Last Dance highlighted a lot of that for Michael Jordan, and how I think it was, number one, kind of a battle for him to stay motivated when he was clearly the best player in the game. And he had to almost like concoct these little, stories and feel slighted by anybody and everybody on the opposing team just to get up to play. But he did it, right, for all those years. But even he stepped away from basketball.
Yeah.
And like took his hiatus in baseball. And so there was stuff going on in his personal life and whatever. But like, was that an indicator if he wasn't motivated anymore? I mean, maybe.
Right. Yeah.
Right. Tom Brady, I think, is a guy who you look at and he just always seemed to have like so much passion and such a fire for the game. It sort of never seemed to be extinguished. So again, maybe those are more outlier people, but the reality is, I think what makes these people truly exceptional, and there actually is research to support this. There's one particular study by a guy named Brandon Chambliss. Have you ever heard of this study? Mm-mm. It's called The Mundanity of Excellence.
Okay.
And essentially what he did, he immersed himself into swim culture to try to understand what are really the differences between kind of the best in the world, international level, Olympic level swimmers, and everybody else, lower levels. And that was the title of the research article. That was the main finding, is that being great is being boring.
Yeah.
And at some point, there are not quantifiable differences that people can make to like improve their skill. It's qualitative changes, right? So people who are the best in the world at what they do, they're doing the same thing, like in swimming, right? Whether you're an Olympian or you are a local swim club, kid who swims a couple days a week, what do you do at swim practice? You swim.
Yeah.
That's it, right? And at some point, even high school kids, like they have the capacity to swim long distances and do hard workouts. It's the quality of the workout that's different, right? So like the technique is better, the mindset is better, the attitude is better, and so on. Like all those little things every single day sort of just add up. And so that's the point is there are certainly going to be days when even elite performers aren't motivated to come up and do the work, right? Like they don't bounce out of bed in the morning like excited, like I'm just going to go attack the day 365 days out of the year.
Right.
It just doesn't work that way. Motivation is so fleeting and it tends to ebb and flow so much. What they do a really good job of is doing the work regardless of how they feel. That's the point. And that's why elite performers, it's not that they're sustaining motivation over the long term. It's they sustain process. They sustain discipline over the long term. To kind of narrow it down, like that's what makes them or sort of like separates them from the pack over time. To even say that they're elite is because of that, not because they just have a greater sense of motivation than others. Yeah.
I love that. So they just don't have sustained motivation over the
I really don't think so. And again, I know I mentioned some of those, elite athletes, but even Tom Brady, I'm sure there were days he didn't want to get up and, go watch 12 hours of film, but he did it. He did it because he knows that's what he needed to do in order to be fully prepared for a Sunday, period.
Yeah, 100%.
Right? There's probably 100 other things that he might rather be doing on any given day. But I'm going to do it because this is what I need to do to be at my best when it matters.
Right.
What about teams?
Yeah. I wish I had come up with a short, succinct answer like you did, but I didn't. I've got a list of a couple things, and we've talked about some of this. But I think, number one, speaking of things we forget to do, is celebrate the small things. Mm-hmm. I think being able to celebrate and look back later on when things get tough, and for a team to be like, hey, but we did that already, and kind of reach back and think, oh, we can do it again, is really important. But to kind of, mark those moments that you can look back on, you have to celebrate, acknowledge the good stuff. I also think just focusing on things that are controllable. So leaders often, if they are frantic, it trickles down to everybody else. And that can be really demotivating when they're talking about all kinds of crazy things that is in nobody's control. But if you can stay focused and disciplined, maybe it's more of a focus and discipline thing than it is motivation. All of a sudden things start to feel like, hey, we can do this. I am motivated to do this. We are motivated to do this as a team. And then just the last thing was debriefing stuff and reflecting on what went well and being able to carry confidence from one thing to the next, knowing that either you're going to continue to do what you were doing well or change what you weren't doing so well.
Yeah. Do you think from a team standpoint, establishing goals?
Definitely establishing goals is important, and then monitoring the progress toward them.
Yeah, I was going to say, because the challenge then is like, okay, we have this goal. We want to win a conference championship or something. And then halfway through our season, like the writing's on the wall that maybe that doesn't happen, isn't going to happen.
Right.
How do we stay motivated?
Yeah.
Like that's what gets really hard. And so I think there's a way to do that to a degree. And it kind of weaves in some of the things that you mentioned. Like we have to acknowledge where we're at any given point.
Yeah.
And then maybe we recalibrate.
Right.
Right. But so, okay, maybe a conference championship's out of the question, but we've got X number of games left. Like we're going to make the most of our season,
right.
And look at some of these opponents we have coming up. There are great opportunities for us, blah, blah, blah. Like you kind of just shift the focus a little bit. But there's still a target that we're aiming for. And I think that's important.
Yeah. And just like the humility at the team, like having teams of people that are humble enough to say like, okay, let's recalibrate and then being okay with that. Because I think it gets hard when you got multiple people that are like, no, like we're pressing ahead. And some people are like, that's not feasible anymore.
Yeah.
So just like being able to come to terms with this is where we're at as a group.
Important that a coach or a leader has the pulse on that too, because like you said, if they stand in front of the room and they're bouncing around all cheery, like
everybody's like, what the heck are you talking about?
Exactly, like hey, we're not stupid, right? Like we've seen all the same stuff that you have. We don't have a pathway to the conference championship game.
Yeah, well now you don't trust them.
Yeah, exactly. Like you can't lie to me.
Yeah.
And you almost lose a little credibility if that's how you try to approach it.
And it's almost like the self-talk thing you're talking about. Like it is a credibility thing. So just everybody being on the same page of like, we're just going to be brutally honest and confront the facts and figure out where we're at and then recalibrate from there as we go. Like that's really important.
Yeah, I'm with you. Yeah, that stuff is challenging though, because, when you start talking about a team on any given day, such a various level of motivation from everybody involved, right? We talked about how that ebbs and flows. We'll multiply that times however many people are involved.
Yeah.
Any given day, you have a smattering of people that are motivated or unmotivated. Everybody can be in it for different reasons potentially. Like, teams are complex. You chose a great field.
Yeah, I mean, it's the gift that keeps giving for sure.
All right, well, let's go ahead and wrap this up. I hopefully this is helpful just to address some of the common questions I think we get and maybe a unique look from the perspective of at like the individual performer level and then also the team, just where we've seen things done well, where we've seen things done unfortunately poorly. So hopefully there's something in there for everybody. Any final thoughts from you?
No, I think hit it on the head.
All right, well, thank you to our listeners. Appreciate you tuning into us. As always, you can leave us a review, rate us, all those good things. We'd love to hear from you. Shoot us any questions that you might be interested in hearing us talk a little bit about, and we will catch you next time on The Growth Project.